Hello, everyone. Welcome to Automation Hour. There we go. All right. Thanks for joining Automation Hour, not the admin preview. We love you. If you're joining us for the first time, all lines are muted. Please post any questions that you have to our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. And sometime after the session, we will post a link to the recording as well as the deck. And if you haven't signed up for our sessions that we have booked out through June, I highly encourage you to do so. And even if you can't, we'll send you the link to the recording, and then you can access that afterwards. So we have some great MVPs, repeat speakers, some first-time speakers. So we're really excited to have so many people come on Automation Hour to share all their knowledge. And I have to send a shout out to our sponsor, Concrete.io, because without them, we cannot bring this webinar series to you for free. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And here are your co-hosts, Rakesh, myself, and David. Back in the good old days when we could congregate together in person, and hopefully after everyone gets vaccinated, we can get back to being together again. This remote virtual thing doesn't really work out very well for me. I like interacting with folks in person. So with that, we're excited to have Anthony on. He is a first-time presenter, but he's attended multiple automation hours. So, and we hope that he'll come back to present. But with that, let me hand over presenter rights to Anthony. And you should have control now. And I see your screen.
Ah, perfect. All right. Oh, I lost it. Just 1 second. Show my screen. All right. So before we get started on our use case for today, let me just jump in a little bit about myself. I am a newly minted technical account manager at Salesforce. This is day 5. And so I'm very excited to be here and not the admin preview. I've had 10+ years in the Salesforce ecosystem in various different roles. I started as an accidental administrator, like so many, and then I became a platform manager and a team lead, most recently a consultant, and now joining the mothership at Salesforce in San Francisco. I'm a Trailhead Ranger with over 100 badges. I've presented at Dreamforce and Snowforce. If you want to follow me, you can do so at Foster Now. Outside of Salesforce and work, I'm very interested. I'm a tragic rugby fan, particularly the Wallabies and the Reds, homebrewing, which I even track in Salesforce, and snowboarding when time allows. Since I am now an employee of Salesforce, I must let you know that all of my opinions are your own, and all of my jokes, as you'll find out, are pretty terrible. All right, so today we want to talk about setting default campaign status values, and we're going to do that using flow and custom metadata. Let's talk a little bit about our agenda here. So we're going to come up with a little business problem. So we use a fictional company to describe the context around what we're trying to solve. We'll do some analysis to really try to understand what we want to do. We'll come up with a design and we'll talk through that and some of the pros and cons. And then we'll go through and some fun stuff for the demo. And then we'll wrap it all up with a recap and some key takeaways and Q&A. Let's talk about our business problem. So we have a fictional company called West Bay Industries located in San Francisco. And the marketing team uses campaigns in Salesforce, and they create a lot of campaigns for their outreach programs to their customers and prospects. Now, because they create a lot of campaigns, users are spending a lot of time configuring those campaigns. So Salesforce doesn't have default values that come out of the box. And so in order to customize those values, then they need to insert those records every time they do that. So that creates a lot of a burden, and it's a real challenge for the team. So let's think about our user story. So the marketing team have come to me and said, hey, as a marketing user, I want member status values automatically inserted so that the values are created quickly and consistently. So time is really a crunch. We're all living in a COVID world, and so we all have new demands and new working environments, and so things that can ease some of the burden of things we have to do are always going to be highly valued. The other piece here is consistency. So we want to make sure that the values that are inserted are always the same for each type of campaign that we're creating. Now, as I mentioned, we have a little problem because Salesforce doesn't actually have a way to set custom default status values out of the box. Now, when you create a campaign, it does insert two default values, sent and responded, which is great, I guess, for if you're always doing email campaigns. But what if you're not? And what if you want to actually have additional status values that represents more an evolution through the life cycle of a campaign journey? Well, it seems like we have a little problem. And if Tom Hanks is telling me that we have a problem, then he is a very trustworthy person. And so I am going to believe that we have a problem. All right. In the words of Barney Stinson, if you're a How I Met Your Mother fan, challenge accepted. So we're going to take the Pepsi challenge and we're going to create a solution that will enable us to create that functionality that will insert those default member status values for us whenever we create a new campaign. Let's talk about success criteria so that we understand whether the thing that we're building is going to solve the problem. So automate. So we spoke about having default values automatically added. Okay, so we're going to save our marketing users a bunch of time, and that's going to provide some consistency as well. Display, we want to insert those values in a set order. Campaigns typically follow a linear progression in their milestones, and we want to make sure that when a user sees those values that they follow that linear progression. Next one is data integrity. So we don't want duplicate values to be inserted. One, because it's confusing for our users. Two, because we want to keep our data hygiene clean. And three, Salesforce might throw an error. And I actually know through a lot of trial and error that it actually will. So we need to make sure that we're not inserting duplicate values because Salesforce won't allow us to do that. Configuration. So this is important. So in thinking about your architecture of your system, we want the ability to be able to change those default values without having to change our automation solution. So providing an interface for users to be able to configure those values and not have to worry about changing the automation every time they make a change. The team is adding new values or adding new default values to represent maybe updated terminology or to add different milestones within their campaigns. And so they want the ability to be able to manage that without having to change their automation solution. And then finally, permissions. So we want to be able to let users know if they need something in order to do the insert of those status values, that they actually get an alert for what they're trying to do. Let's jump into analysis. And I absolutely love this quote. It's by a gentleman by Ian Gotts. He is the CEO of Elements.cloud. And he recently stated on a webinar that analysis comes before build in the dictionary. And so I love that. It kind of perfectly succinct that, it's really kind of painful, or can be, in terms of doing that analysis up front. But taking that step, taking a breath and trying to understand what's the problem we're trying to solve, what options do we have available, what's the best trade-off in terms of pros and cons and what we're trying to achieve, will make building your solution a lot easier. Now, it's not going to solve all of your problems, because obviously as you iterate and as you find new things maybe on the platform that you may need to make changes, but putting this effort up front is going to help you get way ahead and speed up your time to build, because you'll know you've already evaluated those options and you understand what's the most efficient, helping you avoid that rework and helping you deliver value quicker for your customers and stakeholders. Well, before we get started, what even is campaign member status values? Well, they're used to manage member campaign lifecycle. So I mentioned about setting those milestones within that campaign. They tend to follow a linear progress. And so we want to be able to identify where in the lifecycle a lead or a contact as a member is for a specific campaign. They're associated to campaign records, which means we have to have a campaign record to associate a status value to. Okay, so keep that in mind. They're data records. So you can actually insert them through data loader, but this is automation hour. This isn't data loader hour. So we're going to find a solution that we can use through automation rather than having to have users data load for their solutions. They've got two attributes. So one is default and one is responded. So default means it's just setting the default value you want to have associated when a new member is added. So if you don't select another status that's available when they get added, you can set a default so they're automatically associated with a predetermined value. All right, and unfortunately, that is going to be that Salesforce value that comes out of the box when the campaigns are created. Now, a default can only have one selection, but you can have multiple responses. So if you're in marketing and you're tracking attribution and you're tracking activity and you want to understand, well, when did someone first engage, then you can mark something as a response for a value that's assigned as a status, and then that will help with your metrics and monitoring of activity. Out of the box, you get two default values, so sent and responded. They are always created for every campaign without any other automation, and so you can then customize from there. However, you're limited to those two default values, and I'm not aware of any way to stop that or to change those values that get inserted. So now that we understand what they are, let's think about our process. So I like thinking about process in terms of a few steps. And I always keep in mind, I attended a session with the process manager for ExxonMobil. And this gentleman said that you should always try to drill something down into 5 or 6 steps. And he drilled down the entire business into 5 steps for ExxonMobil. So taking that kind of same kind of idea here, we're going to look at what we need to do in order for us to get to where we want to be. So before we even touch any of our system configuration, so we know we need to create a new campaign because the status values can't exist without a campaign. We're going to find our default status values that we've customized. We want to check that the values to insert are unique. So we have to have the uniqueness check. We want to keep our data clean and prevent any errors. We want to determine the order for insert. So let's make sure we understand how we want those values to display. And then we're going to insert those unique status values. So if values already exist, we make sure we don't repeat that. And for those new values, we make sure those values get added. Let's take a look at our solution. So this configuration is a little bit older and doesn't reflect maybe as much of some of the newer functionality in Flow. And you'll see here that we're starting with Process Builder, and I know Salesforce is now starting to encourage you to move to Flow as your trigger for flows. I haven't done that yet, and the reason is for a few. First of all, it's running after insert, so it's the perfect context for Process Builder to run. 2 is that I want to be able to leverage this in a quick action. So I wanted this to be a reusable building block essentially as a flow, so I could use it in other solutions as well. So I'm not rebuilding every time, because there is quite a bit of logic that goes into ensuring that those values can be inserted. We're not preventing duplicates. So I don't want to rebuild that. I want to make sure that I think about scalability of my platform. I build it once and I can use it and leverage it in other places. So using the power of the platform. And 3, the final reason that I'm using Process Builder is that it doesn't support subflows yet for record triggered flows. I know that's on their roadmap, and I like to use a default utility error flow. So if an error comes up in my flow from a lookup, then I use the same default flow, passing in variables from my main flow so that I can trigger actions such as email alerts to certain people so that they're aware that something went wrong. But as the platform gets better and record triggered flows support subflows, then this would be a prime candidate for refactoring and moving it over to a record triggered flow. So for now, we're using our process builder. It's going to trigger our flow. So we're going to use an auto launch flow in order to initiate our automation logic. And it's going to reference custom metadata. And that's how we're going to store our values. So then why would we use custom metadata? Well, custom metadata is essentially an object. It's an object for settings instead of an object for data. It looks just like a custom object. You set it up, very similar to a custom object, but it stores settings that you can use throughout your implementation. So there are a couple options, or 3 options that kind of come to mind when enabling settings. So you could use a custom object, you could use custom settings, or you could use custom metadata. Why would you use custom metadata? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, there's no requirement to enable users who are non-admins to manage values. So that kind of rules out a custom object structure. Now, it does have more flexibility in terms of access, but the challenge becomes when you refresh a sandbox, a developer sandbox, then you have to data load those values in order for your automation to work. And we want to avoid creating extra work for our admin team or for our marketing team. The other option would be to use custom settings. Now, custom settings are great if you need to if you need to leverage values for different users or different groups of users. So custom settings allow you to leverage settings for the organization as a whole, so everyone gets the same thing, or you can use for profile or for user level settings as well. So we don't have that requirement here. All campaigns for all users will all have the same values. So we're going to use custom metadata as our solution to store our values. And I'll show you when we jump into the demo how that is configured. So some benefits for custom metadata, they are configurable. So you can create your own structure and then you can leverage that in different places. And so whether it be in your flows, in your process builder, in your validations, you can utilize that custom metadata in multiple places. It's deployable. So we spoke about where custom settings and objects have to have data loaded when you move them between environments. Well, not with custom metadata. You can take the metadata type and those metadata records, include that in your change set, or if you're using packaging or another deployment method, you can include that metadata and make sure that it is included. All right, it's performant, and so it's going to overall take up less of the Salesforce limits and help you play better in the sandbox, ensuring that you have a performant organization. Now, it's reusable, as I mentioned. You can leverage that in other places. And so it gives you a lot of scalability to kind of use things once, and then you can leverage them in other places. The nice part about that approach is that it enables you to change it once, and then everywhere you change it, everywhere you've referenced it, they automatically get those new settings or those new values that you need to use. So it makes life as an admin much easier so that you can get onto other things that might be more important and more pressing. And then they're packageable. If you are using packages with DX or some other change control implementation, then you can package those settings up and you can deploy them between organizations and make them upgradable as well. If you're not familiar with custom metadata, there is a great trailhead on custom metadata types, and I recommend that is your starting point, to start there to get set up, and then you can use in your developer org, your playground, to go ahead and get started and start creating some custom metadata. All right. So we've talked about our overall process and our overall solution, and so let's kind of marry the two together. Now, this diagram was created in elements.cloud. You don't have to use elements.cloud. You can use any of your preferred drawing tools, whether it be Lucidchart, Visio, I think even Google has one that you can utilize. A diagram, draw it out. I like using elements.cloud. They don't pay me to say that, but I found it very useful. It's also part of the new architecture path within a Trailhead, and so you may hear more about elements.cloud as you go forward. But essentially what this is doing is allow us to kind of visualize as a documentation piece as well what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to build here and how the solution is going to look together. So starting here with creating our campaign, we go ahead, we've got our marketing user creating our campaigns, and then we have our campaign record being inserted. We indicate that we're successful and our campaign was inserted, so now we want to trigger our automation. And so we trigger our automation because our criteria was met. We then look up the custom values that we set, and we've got our flow looking up our custom metadata. And if we don't find any default values, then we're not going to continue on. So we're going to stop the process and make sure that we can do that safely. If we do find values, we need to check for duplicates. We want to make sure that there are no duplicates in the values we're going to insert, because we're going to get an error. So either we validate that there are duplicates and we need to remove those. And once we successfully remove those, we then determine our order, or we've identified that our values are unique and our order can now be determined and prepared for insert of those values. So this is a nice way to visualize, it's a nice way to document, it gives you kind of a nice overview in terms of what you're building, how it works. And so you can explain very easily to even non-technical users what the progression is of this action. Finally, let's talk about permissions. So in order to insert campaign member status values, that's a very long thing to say on a Friday at 12 o'clock, you need to enable the marketing user permission record on a user's record. Now, unfortunately, it has to be per user, and you can't enable it via permission set. It's one of those odd settings that aren't yet available in a permission set. It has to be done on the user record. I'll show you how you can do that in just a second. And it is required even if you're running a flow in system context. So what do I mean by a system context? Well, flows can run in two different contexts. The first one is user context. The second one is system context. Now, in user context, things are a little more restricted. You can only do things that you have been enabled to do. In system mode, you can run either with sharing or without sharing. And in system mode, you have access to all the things that you need with either sharing with records, so enabling against your role and sharing settings, or any sharing settings that have been enabled for you, as well as the default sharing, or non-sharing, so you can see all records. Okay, you're even going to need that setting even if you have the flow running in system context with or without sharing. So just keep that in mind as we go along, and it will give you an error if you try to do something when you don't have that permission enabled. All right, so enough of the PowerPoint slides. Let's jump into the fun stuff and go and see the configuration. So we're going to focus on two use cases here. We're going to go ahead and create campaigns, and then we'll update a status value and show you how you can keep that in sync. So why don't I switch gears here, and we'll go into our developer org. So this is a developer org. It does not have a lot of build out, so your environment may look different depending on if you're using a production instance or a sandbox. I always recommend when you're building anything, build that in a sandbox first. Make sure that you can test, it does the things you can do, and then when you get sign off, you can push that up to production. We are here in setup, and I'm in the Lightning experience, and I've gone into my personal user settings under my profile here. So if we just jump into settings, then I've jumped into my advanced user details. I did that because I wanted to show you that I have this marketing user permission enabled. So here it is here. You'll see that you'll need to enable that in order for you to have the ability to create custom member status values. And that applies whether you're using automation or not. All right. It's very easy to enable. You can click edit, and then you can turn it on and off depending on what access is required. So before we get started, always make sure that you have that available. I want to set a baseline in terms of where we are without our automation. So I'm going to jump over here into campaigns, and these are the campaigns I've created today. Let's go ahead and create a new campaign, so we'll see how things work out of the box. All right, we are going to create a conference, and let's call it the Automation Hour Conference. Very imaginative title. In the interest of time and my typing skills, I've left a lot of fields unrequired. Obviously, I don't recommend this as a strategy because you want to make sure that you are validating important information. But just for our demo, I'm going to leave these blank. And I'm just going to say demo conference. And we've met all of our required fields. And so why don't we go ahead and we'll save that record. All right, so we got our green banner of success, which is great. And you'll notice that we've got our sent and responded values set. So they're the default values you get out of the box. One thing I want to make known or to share with you is that we don't want these values for a conference because they're not appropriate, but we can't just go ahead and delete them. So if I try to delete, say, for this responded value, you'll notice that it is responded. If I delete, I'm going to get this error once I click and delete. It's going to tell me at least one status has to be set to responded. Okay, so that's important when approached for our automation. We can't just go ahead and delete these existing values. So we need a way to kind of insert our custom values and then look to check to see if these values should still be kept. All right. So now that we understand our baseline, I'll go ahead and show you the configuration for custom metadata and also how we reference that within our flow. Take note that we have this update member statuses action up here. We're going to look at that later on, and once we've gone through the setup, then I'll show you, we'll come back to our record, we'll make a change, and then I'll show you how you can keep those values in sync. All right, let us go into setup. So let's jump up into setup here, up into setup. So I'm in the home tab, and then I want to look for custom metadata. So under custom code, I found my custom metadata types, and I want to click on that option here. And now you can see that the custom metadata types that I have set. So our settings here have been configured within our campaign member status setting. So that's the custom setting that I want to, custom metadata that I want to access. So I'm going to click on custom metadata settings. And you'll see here that even though we're in custom metadata, this looks very much like a custom object. You give it a name, it has a plural, you can give it a description, and I recommend that you always do. You can have custom fields, you can have validation rules, you can have page layouts. So custom metadata is essentially, as I said, it looks like a custom object for all intents and purposes. The easiest way to think about custom metadata is it's a custom object for your settings. And you can utilize those settings throughout your organization. In order to look at our records, we go ahead and click on manage. So you'll see manage and then the name of the custom setting. Sorry, custom metadata. Keep confusing those. So go ahead and click on manage and then the name of your metadata type. And you can see that I've set up a view here in order to show you the default status values that I've set up. So let's jump out of the view and let's go into see all. And we'll use our other all view here. So now hopefully you can see that we've got a bunch of values set up. And you can see that we have a label value for the value we want to insert. We've got setting name, a campaign type. So this is going to be our controlling field value. So based on the type that we create, we're going to associate values to be able to be inserted. We've got an order number, so we want to make sure that we're controlling the order so that they come in a certain sequence. And then also our options for default and also for responded. And this is a very flat structure, and I could have actually used probably a custom type. This is for a demo, and so in a small organization, at least for now. So as you kind of think about scaling up, you may want to utilize custom metadata relationships, but right now we're kind of, just for the demo, I'm keeping things kind of flat so you can kind of see how things are set up. All right, and then I'm utilizing these list views in order to help me filter down on specific events. The one thing to keep in mind here is that these orders they pertain to this campaign type. So you can see that I've got some duplicates here. So for example, I've got email, 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30, and then for webinars, and then I've got some default values as well. All right, and if I want to filter down just to see event values, then I can see all of my values here. Adding a value is very simple. So our last value is 70, and I recommend if you're creating with these orders, you can add some spacing between the numbers. It won't affect how the automation is inserted. Salesforce will still insert 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but this is a mechanism that allows you to easily kind of change values or add values and then not have to reorder every single record every time. So for example, if you wanted to insert, say, a new value and you wanted it to go directly after attended but between not attended, then maybe partially attended, then you could use say 45 or 42, then that order would say that it would be attended, partially attended, and then not attended. All right, and to create your new values, simply click on new. You need to give it a name. So let's say partially attended. We'll make that to be 45, just as we said. We want our campaign type to be event. And we're going to say that that is a responded value. One thing to note is that this name must be unique. So if you have the same value across different type values for your campaign, you're going to need to make sure that this is a unique value. So what I usually do is just put on the type at the end. So for example, if say a conference had partially attended, I would need to make sure that even though we use the label, that this name is unique across all of my metadata records within my specific type. Go ahead and hit save. Okay, it's created my metadata, and unfortunately I have to jump back here. It's custom metadata types, and then back to our member status settings and into manage. And now you can see here we've got attended, partially attended, and not attended. So it's automatically set that up for us. So these are the setting values that are going to allow us to have our automation to be configurable without having to change our automation. So now that we have our custom metadata set up, next thing we need to do is go and take a look at the flow that actually leverages and looks up these references. So let's go ahead, we're going to leave custom metadata. Let's jump into flow over here. And we use flow in the quick find and then click on flow under our process automation. So I have created a filtered view here to focus on just the flows that we want to look at. And today we're going to look at three flows: an auto launch flow, a screen flow, and an error utility. So we'll be focusing on our auto launch flow because that is the majority of the logic. Our screen flow, how we leverage that auto flow, and then how we use our utility as a reference for use throughout our other flow so that we're not recreating error messages as we go. So let's go ahead and we'll jump into our campaign member status values. And I'll scroll over here because I always forget, because if I'm in Classic, I always just click the title. All right, and so let's go into our current version. And we can see how this is set up. So let's zoom out here for a second. This is kind of a subway map. And so my attempt here would be kind of give you a quick overview, but kind of break it down into the steps that we talked about. So inserting, making sure we find a campaign, check our values, make sure we don't have duplicates, set our order, and insert our values. So let's zoom in here. So first of all, we want to set some flow variables. So we go ahead and do that by setting our stage and then also our current record ID using record ID. And I'll speak about this variable in just a second. So the next thing we want to do is make sure we have a campaign. So we're feeding a campaign ID from our process on which the process, the process is running from. So we want to make sure we can find that campaign record. So let's get a get record and we go ahead and get that campaign. You'll notice we're using ID equals a record ID. Now that is actually a special variable in the flow and it is case sensitive. So you must have it in this exact format. The reason why I've chosen this format and to use this variable is because I want to leverage this flow within a screen flow, and using that will enable me to do that. Okay, and I'll show you how that's configured when we jump into the screen flow. I'm not worrying about sorted, and I only want to get the first record because I'm only filtering on a single ID. And then of course, I'm going to let Salesforce do all the magic behind the scenes and only grab the fields that I am going to need for my flow. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and not move it around, but do actually a campaign check. So as we go through our flow, we want to make sure that if we're doing records or we're validating to make sure that what we expected to find, we actually did find. So if we do find a campaign, then let's go ahead and we grab that variable, and because we use that throughout the flow. So I store that in a temporary variable that I'm using, but I'm taking it essentially from that record that I found. And of course, I'll make mention that I always put in descriptions about what things are. It may seem very obvious, but maybe it doesn't seem obvious for other users that are coming in. I always recommend putting a description even for your sub settings, because sometimes it may not be obvious what is occurring, or you may need to leverage it in other places, and flows can get tricky. They can get complex, just like this one here. And so it's a nice little breadcrumb trail, enable you to understand where something is being used or how it's being used, so you can be more efficient and effective. Let's click cancel there. All right. So the next thing we want to do is grab existing values. So we talked about having to check for duplicates. Again, we're taking campaign member status and we're looking at our campaign ID, looking at our record ID, and this time we're taking it in our sort order. So this is important because we want to grab those orders for those records that already exist, and then we want to make sure that the next record that we insert is going to be, in our case, number 3. So because we already have 1 and 2 taken up, then we want to make sure that we get that in the right order and then order them sequentially based on that sort order that we set in our custom metadata. Again, we're going to grab we're going to grab all our records because we should have multiple records associated, because it's a collection of values for status records. And then we automatically, again, store all the fields and let Salesforce do the magic behind the scenes. All right. I like to use this as a little trick, mainly for debugging, but it's also helpful in terms of what expected records you're expected to find and helping you validate if something goes wrong. So I actually like to get a count, and I actually like to store that in a variable. And so you can utilize this trick. You used to have to use a loop rather, in order to get this count. Now you can get this available automatically. So what I'm doing here is actually taking a number variable and I'm getting the count of records so that are existing. So this way I understand how many values are actually set. Now, I know when a campaign is inserted, it's always going to be 2, but if I'm leveraging this from something that's already existing, maybe it's not. Maybe it's more than 2. Maybe they have existing default values. Maybe those values have been changed and the user needs to reset the campaign member status values that are associated to a specific campaign record. So it's always nice to kind of get a count, and then you can leverage that within your debug, or the other option you can use if you're using alerts or if you're using confirmation screens and things like that. It's nice to be able to present to the user to say, hey, we took an action on X number of records, or we found X number of results. And so it allows you to easily give that information so users know what to expect, and they have confidence that your flow is working as expected and it's impacting the records that they expected it to act on. So a really nice feature. I recommend you using that, particularly when you're using your collection variables. We then go and grab our custom metadata status values. And so again, we are grabbing a campaign type. Sorry, we're getting our status values, but we're utilizing a campaign type to use as our filter. So whatever the campaign type is matches to our custom metadata. And then again, we're taking that in a specific sort order so that we can leverage that when we go to insert those values. Just like with our existing campaign status value records, we're going to grab all records for our custom values because we can have more than one. And we're going to store, let Salesforce do the storing for all of our fields. Again, we take a count just to make sure we have values that we need to check. And then we have a decision. So we make a decision in terms of what we want to do. And so we've got our values that already exist. So did we find a result essentially? So from our member setting values, did we find something? Making sure is null is false. And if we didn't, then no values were found. And if nothing is found, then we want to make sure that we don't take any action to try to insert records. Here I've got a value that I am inserting, and I just did that for debug. It updates a field on the campaign to say the automation ran, but it didn't find any values to insert, and then we go ahead and update our record. And then finally, we make a decision, did we actually add anything? And if we didn't, then we don't want anything to happen. if we did find values, well, we have two things that we need to do. We need to first loop over our values. So we're going to take a collection, and these are our custom values, and we want to see if our custom values already exist. And so for each item, we need to loop over the existing status values. So we take our collection and we loop over and we check each item within our second collection, and we do a duplicate check. And it's very simple in terms of the way that we evaluate our criteria. So we look and say, hey, does the value that we're currently checking, does it already exist, the current item? And so we want to understand, does that custom value match an existing value within our status list that we already have inserted? And so if it does, then we go ahead and assign it a duplicate check. So status is assigned, we go ahead and use a counter to indicate that that actually had a match. And if it doesn't, we go back into our list of values and then try to find any matches. Once we've gone through all of the existing values, then we have to make a decision. Did we find a match or didn't we? So if we don't find a match, then we go ahead and we skip that record. So, but if we do find a match that's not unique, then we don't want to insert that duplicate. But if it is unique, then we actually go ahead and add that to a collection of values that we want to add. So go ahead and set the sort order and then unique status counter. We reset that because we're going to evaluate against a new type. So we complete that step and then we come out with a bunch of unique values. The total unique values to assign, and that tells us how many records we expect status value records to be created. We then do a check to say, hey, did we actually find any records to insert? Because what happens here is that, say for example, I am creating an email campaign and my values are actually sent and responded. Then I've verified that we don't have duplicates, but I also don't have any values to insert. So I need to make sure that I have a control. And then I set my value of my automation in my debug field and say that we didn't do anything. And again, we update our campaign with that value, and then we stop in our process flow. If we do, however, we want to go ahead and create our values. Now, in order to be efficient, we need to use another loop. We're going to use a record variable this time in order to create our member status values. So a record variable holds data for us to create records in bulk. So we map our fields from our newly created record campaign status value, and we utilize the variables from our flow. So we've got our value to insert that's currently in our loop. We're going to take the campaign ID that we got earlier in our flow. We're going to add if it's a response or not, if it's the default value, and then we go ahead and set our sort order using a formula. So counting the number of existing values, and then we add one for each cycle through our loop. The next piece, then we just jump and add that to a collection to insert, so a separate collection. So to make sure that we are doing things in bulk, we always want to optimize for the platform. And so we go ahead and just add that new record variable to a collection variable for us to insert in one foul swoop. So once it's gone through that loop, I'm updating the stage to set to insert values, and then we go ahead and insert that collection. So the collection of campaign member status values to insert, we go ahead and update multiple records, potentially multiple records, all in one shot. So making sure that we're being efficient and we are bulkifying our flow. I then have a step that sets our automation value to say that we inserted values, and then we update our campaign status with that value. Now this last piece here is where we try to remove the default values that get inserted. And I say try to remove because I did some testing and found this to be inconsistent. I'm hoping that it'll work, but if it doesn't, then I still have some homework to do. But essentially what we're trying to do is we want to determine if we still need those values that get defaulted by Salesforce. So the sent rather and responded. you notice that when we created that default campaign out of the box, those values, we couldn't automatically delete them. So what we need to do is insert our values first, and then check, once we've got all of our newly inserted values, do we actually still need those other values? And so in order for us to do that, we go ahead, grab our new set of status values that we have, make a decision and make sure that we found values. And then we try to loop over those values and evaluate if they are in the values that we wanted to insert. So if they're not, we go ahead and add them to a collection to delete. And then once we finish it with all of our values, we do our check again to say, hey, can we do a check to validate how many records that we have? Sorry, to assign our values. We then finally do a check, do we have any records to delete? And if we do, we update our stage assignment, and then we go ahead and delete those records. And of course, I've leveraged the subflow here in order if the delete fails for any reason, then I'm going to get an alert for that. So one thing, yeah, I think we covered this, so that's all okay. So that essentially is our flow. And so there are quite a few pieces, but if we kind of break it down, we can kind of understand how things are happening. So why don't we now go back and let's create an automation hour webinar. Let's see. So this is a type webinar. And of course, if you have different criteria, you could have that. Say, for example, you might have region. So you might want to extend it through that. So here is our webinar. Again, we'll keep these fields blank because this is just my developer account. This is from a demo. Let's go ahead and hit save. And here we go. We've got our values automatically added for this campaign type. So it didn't look like it removed the set and responded values, so it looks like I still have some work to do, and hopefully I will put together a blog post in terms of update. But you can see the power of using that flow and that automation. So if users are creating a lot of campaigns, then those values are going to be automatically set for them, and they're going to make sure that they have the values that they needed in order to move forward. All right. Now, I did speak about changes and putting things in sync. So let's go ahead, let's create an email campaign here. So automation, our email campaign. Let's choose our type as email, and we'll save that. So you notice we've got three values here. So I sent responded, which is our default values, and those are values that we actually want. And then we have this went to spam value. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. So you can now see that we have two values, and now I've got this action here. Before I do, I just want to do something quickly. I'm going to remove this marketing user permission. All right. And then we'll give this a refresh. And so let's say someone made a mistake. They said, oh, hang on, I don't think we need that. And then they went, oh, yes, we actually do. Or for example, a status value is added. Right now, if a new metadata value is added, then it doesn't automatically add anything to your campaign data. So you have to trigger that manually. So if we want the ability to kind of keep this in sync, we can use this update member statuses value, action here. So let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. So go ahead and run my action, and whoops, something went wrong. So this is telling me that I need the marketing user permission on my user record in order to update campaign statuses. Contact support for assistance. So let's finish off our flow here. So nothing has happened. You can see no change has happened here. So we're handling the error that would happen. So everyone's seen the red text of a flow failure or a process failure. And so this helps us avoid this by ensuring that we're handling our defaults. And so if I now refresh this, now that I've got that enabled, and we can update our member statuses, let's see what happens. Survey says our automation ran successfully, and we can click finish to exit the flow. And now here's our new value that we added. So now we've got our campaign member statuses in sync. So how do we do that? Well, we utilize a screen flow in order to connect to an action that we've created. And this one is really simple. It attempts to get the user record. Again, we're using our error subflow. We make sure that we have our campaign record for the variable that's passed. And then we run our auto launched flow. So we're actually utilizing all of that logic that we built in the other place, and we're leveraging it within our screen flow so we can take advantage of all that goodness that we have in that other flow and enable it to now to be used for other use cases. So it limits our amount of rework and enables us to better support the organization by not cluttering up with duplication. All right, and then we've added a simple update screen confirmation for users, or if they see they don't have the permission that they need and they're not a marketing user. So one thing I'll make note here is that you'll actually see a reference to label. And so what that is actually a custom label. So you can use custom labels within your text in order to help customize your messages and separate it again from your automation solution. So for example, if you wanted to say something else instead of just, hey, click finish to end the flow, or for example, you have multi-language users and you need to put it into other languages, then utilizing custom labels for text references for output text are a great way to support that, again, removing the need to change your automation if you have a need to change your text. So it's really quite a simple flow, but incredibly powerful in terms of leveraging the power of the platform and things you've already created, but then also giving users a nice user interface to help them get on with their journey and get on with their day. Let's go back and finish off with our slides now that we've done our demo. Let's wrap it up. So some feature enhancement ideas, so bulk option for updating status changes, removing those default values. You could enable for additional trigger criteria. So if you're thinking about building something like this, and I did recently discover that there is a subflow that is created as an Apex action that you could utilize, sorry about that, for a record triggered flow. So I haven't dived into that yet, but that is the next piece that I'd like to expand this to see if we can remove that process builder from the trigger. The takeaways, so you can further customize this solution. Again, we leverage custom metadata. So there's object for custom settings for reusable values. Don't forget to assign the marketing user to your users. Custom metadata field values and member status values have to be unique. Space out your order so that you can insert new values without having to reorder all of your values, and utilize custom labels where you can to help manage your output text. And with that, I will hand it up back to Jen and open it up for questions.
Great. So if you have any questions, you can post them out on our Trailblazers community or also in the questions area of this webinar. We do have one from Felice. How many campaign types was the org using when you created this automation?
So my fictitious organization, and I'd love to say West Bay because everyone says East Bay, South Bay, or North Bay in San Francisco, but never West Bay. It had 3 set up for the demo, but you know, the world is your oyster. There are limits on the size of custom metadata records that you can create. And you know, if you have a large number, then maybe this is not the solution. But you know, it's fairly extensible in terms of the values that you could create. And again, thinking about if you do have a larger implementation, you may want to consider having things broken out. So you have your trigger, which is your type values in one set of custom metadata, and then use a relationship to assign those dependent values for each type. So yeah, so this is a small kind of sample for the demo to kind of, you know, show you the potential, but you know, the world is your oyster as long as you're playing within the limits of Salesforce. And as I said, if you have a large scale implementation where you have multiple criteria and multiple values and multiple dependencies, then you know, maybe you need to think about some other potential architecture if you're getting to that scale.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, another question came in from Elias. How do you manage to get the new status updated inserted into the campaign when selecting a value from the pick list, like webinar or email, by using the Create Campaign New button default value feature in Salesforce?
Oh yeah, you can add a new value. Yeah, let's go ahead and just do that. So you can still do this as well. Let's say the email went to folder, went to filter. Okay, so you can still do that. And then I can get my go to webinar out of the way. Let's go ahead and click save. So yeah, so you can still add custom values if you need to. I don't know if that answered your question, but let me know if it didn't. But again, if you go ahead and click on update member status, it's going to find that's not in the default set. So it's going to actually remove this value.
All right, next question from Neil. Great webinar. Are you aware of any way to auto update status to opened for email campaign?
Okay, so when you are inserting those records, you want it to say open instead. Yeah, you could actually say, I mean, in our configuration, I just use the same values. I wanted to do that just to show that we're not going to create duplicates and we're going to be able to handle Salesforce's default values. But absolutely, you could configure in your custom metadata to say, hey, I want to have opened instead of sent or responded. In your case, if you wanted to default to open, you could absolutely set that as a value and then configure it to be both the default as well.
Great. So folks, if you have any additional questions for Anthony related to his presentation or any just general process automation question, feel free to ask that. So while we just wait and see if anyone is typing the question in, Anthony, how did you get started with learning Flow? I always like hearing people's stories about that.
Yeah, I sat in a client meeting and was asked to create an application that would track a lead's journey from creation through to conversion, through to opportunity creation and to close, and track all of the stages that would happen as kind of qualification, conversion, to close. And saying that, well, that's kind of standard flow, but it could also start from a contact, or it could also start from an opportunity, and we want to be able to see it from a single kind of interface. Oh, and by the way, we'd like to do it all declaratively. So I had no choice but to learn to get into Flow, and I was a little bit intimidated by it, but with the help of all three of the presenters, the organizers, your blogs and kind of just trial and error, I was able to come up with a solution and try to really understand kind of the power of Flow. And I think it's, one thing I've learned is that, you kind of learn these patterns and learn these kind of consistent things, and then kind of, you have these building blocks you can leverage. And so it kind of takes away some of the mystery and some of the fear of getting started with Flow. But yeah, it was a pretty wild journey, and now I've done some, some really interesting things like a guided sales wizard that's in dual language, and this automation presentation, and so yeah, it definitely showcases a lot of power of what you can do with Flow.
And how long did it take you to build the Flow, that first one that you walked us through in the presentation today?
It's a big long one. It's gone through a few iterations. If you saw the number of versions that I had created, and so it took 3 or 4 hours in terms of the first go to kind of get something stable. And then it's gone kind of through evolution, right? I've learned a lot along the way, and kind of taking micro steps to kind of, okay, I've got this far, and I like to test as I go. So I was constantly like, okay, I got this little bit done. Now let's test that to make sure that works, and then let's kind of continue on. So, I understand when you're building something that can be quite complex, it can be discouraging. It kind of, particularly if you're troubleshooting and trying to understand how things work. So I like to just try to break it down into little pieces and then kind of check myself as I go. And that's why I
Mm-hmm.
say that decision, I call them checks. It's like, hey, let's check, let's stop, let's check, make sure we work up to here, and then what are we
Mm-hmm.
going to do next?
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so Neil followed up. He said, "Sorry, I wasn't clear. I know that Salesforce gives a default report showing recipients that open email sent from Salesforce. I was wondering if you know of a way to update the campaign status to opened if they are in that report."
Hmm. I will admit I am not sure. So the campaign member would get associated. I don't know how they're getting updated in the first place because they have to be updated, I imagine, to get on that report. So if you update the status, then they would assume that they would get on that report. And since I'm not sure which report you're leveraging, it's hard for me kind of to determine what the answer is there.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to direct message me and I can take a look, or if you want to share the name of the report type, then maybe I can follow up with a better answer.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
All right. So we're a little over on time. Great content, lot of best practices. So thank you for sharing that. Um, and okay, so Neil said no worries. So follow up. So with that, we're going to close out on this automation hour. Thank you, Anthony, for coming and presenting for the first time. And please come back again and present. That was awesome.
Joe, thanks for having me. Have a great
All
weekend,
right.
everyone.
And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Our next automation hour is on February 12th. Thanks.